Air Force One lifted off from Beijing Capital International Airport at 11:47 p.m. local time, its running lights slicing through a sky thick with industrial haze. No ceremony, no final handshake on the tarmac, no cameras from the Chinese state press pool that had followed the summit's every choreographed moment for the past 3 days. Just the scream of engines, a sharp banking turn over the Forbidden City's darkened outline, and then altitude, fast, deliberate, final. Inside the pressurized cabin, no one was sleeping. The president sat at the central conference table, jacket off, tie loosened to the second button, a printed brief face down in front of him that he had already read 4 times. Across from him, the National Security Advisor stared at her laptop screen with the concentration of someone defusing a device. The Secretary of the Treasury worked his phone with both thumbs, simultaneously fielding calls from the Federal Reserve Chairman and a frantic Deputy Chief of Staff back in Washington who had been awake for 31 hours straight. The summit had not gone well. That was the diplomatic understatement of the decade, and everyone in the cabin understood it without needing to say it. 3 days of talks in the Great Hall of the People had produced nothing. No joint communique, no framework agreement, no symbolic handshake photograph for the history books. The Chinese delegation had been polite, methodical, and completely immovable. On every pressure point, semiconductor export controls, South China Sea militarization, Taiwan arms sales, fentanyl precursor trafficking, currency manipulation, the Chinese side had listened, nodded, offered tea, and given nothing. What they had done in the final session on the 3rd day was present a counteroffer so audacious it had briefly silenced the entire American delegation. China proposed a new bilateral framework, one that would require the United States to formally recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, lift all semiconductor export restrictions, dismantle the Indo-Pacific military alliance infrastructure, and withdraw naval assets from the South China Sea within 18 months. In exchange, Beijing offered a 10-year trade stability agreement and a promise to discuss fentanyl precursor controls at a future date to be determined. The president had listened to the full translation, stood up from the table, buttoned his jacket, and left the room. No response. No counter. Just the sound of a chair scraping marble and the American delegation filing out behind him in silence. Now, at 39,000 feet over the Yellow Sea, the decision was being made. The brief on the table was titled Executive Action. Emergency Tariff Restructuring, People's Republic of China, Schedule Food Escalation. It had been drafted in secret over the preceding 6 weeks by a small team at the Office of the United States Trade Representative, working in coordination with the Treasury Department, the National Economic Council, and a group of outside economic advisors whose names did not appear on any public disclosure. The core of the document was a single number, 500%. A universal tariff rate of 500% on all goods imported from the People's Republic of China to take effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on the morning following the president's return to Washington. Across every category: electronics, apparel, pharmaceuticals, rare earth minerals, steel, aluminum, consumer goods, industrial components, machinery, chemicals, agricultural inputs, everything. No carve-outs, no phase-in periods, no exemptions for allied companies operating on Chinese soil. A clean, total vertical wall of economic force. The document also contained a secondary measure that was, in its own way, even more destabilizing. A freeze on the settlement of all outstanding U.S. Treasury obligations held by Chinese sovereign wealth funds and state-linked financial institutions, pending a 90-day national security review. A mechanism that had never been invoked before in the history of the Republic. One that sat in a legal gray zone so vast that 3 different constitutional scholars had already been quietly consulted and had given 3 different answers about its validity. The legal exposure was enormous. The economic disruption would be immediate, global, and violent. The political blowback would begin within hours of the announcement and would not stop for months, possibly years. American companies manufacturing in China, which was to say a significant portion of the American consumer economy, would face instantaneous collapse of their supply chains. Prices for electronics, clothing, pharmaceuticals, and hundreds of categories of consumer goods would spike within weeks. Stock markets globally would open in a state of shock. The National Security Advisor closed her laptop. The Chinese won't see this as economic policy, she said. They'll read it as a declaration. It is a declaration, the president said. That's the point. We'll need allies locked in before announcement. The EU will panic. Japan will hedge. South Korea has too much exposure to Chinese supply chains to commit publicly inside 24 hours. Then we call them after we sign it, the Treasury Secretary said, not looking up from his phone. They'll adjust. They always adjust. This isn't adjusting, the NSA said. This is restructuring the entire architecture of global trade in one document, in one night, from a plane over the Pacific. The architecture was broken, the president said. No one disagreed with that. The disagreement was entirely about the remedy. It was 2:14 a.m. in Shanghai when the first signal leaked. It did not come from a government source, a wire service, or a deliberate plant. It came from a flight tracking website, a hobbyist-grade open-source platform used by aviation enthusiasts, where a user in Taiwan noticed that Air Force One had departed Beijing 6 hours ahead of schedule without the usual departure sequence of press pool aircraft and support vehicles. The post was 3 sentences long and accompanied by a screenshot of a radar track. It was shared 14 times in the first minute. By 2:22 a.m., it was on the terminal screens of 3 different hedge fund trading desks in Hong Kong. By 2:31 a.m., the Hang Seng futures were moving. Currency traders in Singapore began repositioning against the yuan at 2:39 a.m. Not aggressively, not yet. Just a gentle, careful, almost surgical adjustment of exposure. The kind of move that professionals make when they sense something coming but cannot yet name it. A tightening, a coiling. In London, where it was 6:44 p.m. and the city's financial district was emptying into a Tuesday evening, the first alerts began pinging on the phones of fund managers heading for the tube. By 7:15 p.m. London time, trading desks that had been sending people home were calling them back. By 7:30, the overnight derivatives market was showing stress patterns that had no obvious catalyst, at least not one that had been publicly announced. In New York, it was 1:44 p.m. The market was still open. The Dow had been trading flat for most of the session, digesting the uneventful first and second days of the Beijing summit. At 1:51 p.m., with no public news to explain it, the index dropped 340 points in 4 minutes on volume that spiked to 3 times the session average. The algo-driven pattern recognition systems that now accounted for a significant portion of all equity trading in the United States detected the anomaly in the Hong Kong and Singapore futures markets and began reacting to the reaction. The VIX, the market's fear gauge, moved from 16.4 to 21.7 in less than 8 minutes. Financial journalists at Bloomberg and Reuters began making calls. Every source they reached said the same thing. I don't know anything specific, but something is happening. This was, in the language of financial intelligence, a very loud statement. By the time Air Force One crossed the international dateline, 3 major investment banks had quietly begun hedging their China exposure. 2 sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf had started moving money. A cryptocurrency exchange in the Cayman Islands reported an unusual spike in dollar-denominated stablecoin purchases from accounts traced to mainland Chinese IP addresses. The document had not been signed, the announcement had not been made, but the market, that vast distributed intelligence that aggregates millions of individual bets about the future, had begun to price in something catastrophic. Part 4. Beijing at 4 a.m. The call from the Chinese Foreign Ministry to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing came at 4:07 a.m. local time. The duty officer who answered described it later in a cable to Washington as the most controlled expression of fury I have ever heard from a Chinese official. The deputy foreign minister did not raise his voice. He did not make threats, at least not explicit ones. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes in Mandarin, at normal pace, with no particular emphasis, and said the following: that the People's Republic of China was aware of certain reports regarding the possible economic actions being contemplated by the American government, that such actions, if confirmed, would constitute an unprecedented act of economic aggression, that the Chinese government would be compelled to respond with all measures necessary and proportionate to protect the interests of the Chinese people and the stability of the global economic order, and that the United States government should understand clearly and without ambiguity that the era of asymmetric patience on the part of the People's Republic of China has concluded. The phrase, "the era of asymmetric patience has concluded," did not have an obvious precedent in Chinese diplomatic language. That was precisely why it was alarming. The duty officer immediately elevated the cable to flash priority, the highest category in the State Department communication system, reserved for situations that require immediate attention at the most senior levels. It reached the Secretary of State's secure phone at 4:23 a.m. Beijing time, 4:23 p.m. the previous day in Washington, as Air Force One was still somewhere over the mid-Pacific. The Secretary of State called the National Security Advisor on the plane. The National Security Advisor walked the 20 feet from her seat to the president's chair and placed her phone on the table. The president read the cable summary. He looked out the window at the black ocean below. He picked up the pen. He did not sign yet, but he held it. Part 5. The Architecture of Retaliation. China's economic leverage over the United States was not a theoretical abstraction. It was a specific, documented, and deeply uncomfortable fact that policymakers in Washington had been wrestling with and largely declining to fully confront for more than 2 decades. The People's Republic held approximately $850 billion in U.S. Treasury securities, making it the second largest foreign holder of American government debt after Japan. A decision to liquidate that position, or even to signal the intention to do so, would not destroy the American economy, but it would cause immediate and severe disruption in bond markets, drive up yields, increase borrowing costs, and trigger a cascade of secondary effects that would take years to fully work through the system. Beyond the financial leverage, the supply chain exposure was staggering. Approximately 78% of all active pharmaceutical ingredients used in American-made drugs were sourced from China or from Chinese-controlled manufacturing operations in third countries. The rare earth minerals essential to the production of F-35 fighter jets, Abrams tanks, guided missiles, and virtually every category of advanced electronic system in the American military were, to a degree that had never been fully remedied despite years of policy attention, still overwhelmingly dependent on Chinese extraction and processing. In the consumer economy, the dependence was even more visible. An estimated 34% of all goods sold on the American market in the previous fiscal year had originated in whole or in part from Chinese manufacturing. Electronics, toys, clothing, furniture, tools, household goods, sporting equipment. The shelves of every Walmart, Target, Home Depot, and Amazon warehouse in the country were stocked, in substantial measure, with Chinese production. The 500% tariff did not mean those goods would stop flowing. It meant they would become, overnight, economically inaccessible to ordinary American consumers. A television that retailed for $400 would face an import cost structure that made it impossible to sell for less than $1,800. A pair of sneakers sourced from a Chinese factory, even a factory that nominally produced for an American brand, would face similar mathematics. The inflation shock would be immediate, concentrated, and felt most severely by the Americans who could least afford it. This was not a secret. The economic modeling had been done. The administration had the numbers. Everyone on that plane understood what was inside the document they were being asked to sign. The question, the only question, was whether the alternative was worse. Part 6. The Allies react. The secure diplomatic communications network lit up across 4 continents in the 6 hours before Air Force One touched down at Joint Base Andrews. The British Prime Minister's office sent a formal query through back channels at 11:45 p.m. GMT. Can you confirm or deny reports of imminent trade action against China? We have significant exposure concerns. The query was acknowledged, but not answered. The German Chancellor called the U.S. ambassador in Berlin personally at 12:30 a.m. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. The ambassador reported that the Chancellor's tone was alarmed but measured, and that she had used the phrase coordinated Allied approach 3 times in 11 minutes, which was, diplomatically speaking, a form of pleading. The Japanese foreign minister sent a 4-page written brief through the embassy channel outlining Japan's specific vulnerabilities, the interlocking nature of Japanese, Korean, and Chinese manufacturing supply chains, the exposure of Japanese automakers to Chinese component suppliers, the currency implications for the yen if the yuan came under sustained pressure, the risk of Chinese economic retaliation against Japanese firms operating in China, all framed with exquisite politeness and enormous urgency. South Korea simply went quiet, which was its own form of communication. When Seoul stops calling Washington, Washington has learned to worry. In Brussels, the European Commission's Trade Directorate issued an urgent internal briefing at 1:15 a.m., noting that any U.S. action of the rumored scale would immediately trigger EU consultation requirements under bilateral trade frameworks, and that the Commission would have no choice but to publicly call for restraint, which, in diplomatic language, meant publicly distancing from Washington's position before the ink was dry. The picture that assembled itself from this traffic was not encouraging. The United States was preparing to execute the single largest act of unilateral trade escalation in the post-war global order. Its closest allies were not on board. Several were preparing to explicitly oppose it. The multilateral architecture, the WTO, G7 coordination mechanisms, bilateral consultation frameworks, was about to be bypassed entirely, not through incompetence, but through deliberate choice. The administration's calculation was not that allies would support the action. The calculation was that, after the initial panic, they would adapt to it, that the world would adjust to a new structure the way water adjusts to a new container, finding its level, following the new shape, eventually appearing as if it had always been this way. Whether that calculation was correct would determine, more than any other single factor, whether this moment was remembered as a turning point or a catastrophe. Part 7. Signing at 38,000 feet. The President signed the executive order at 3:44 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, while Air Force One was approximately 340 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. He used the same pen he had used to sign 3 previous executive orders on this trip. He signed his name in the space provided, then initialed the 2 attached schedules, Schedule A being the tariff rate tables, Schedule B being the Treasury settlement freeze mechanisms and legal justification framework. He placed the pen down on the table. The National Security Advisor immediately forwarded the digital authorization code to the office of the USTR, the Treasury Department, and the White House Communications Office. The USTR's automated systems would begin processing the new tariff schedules for Customs and Border Protection. Treasury would issue the settlement freeze notice through its regulatory apparatus. The Communications Office would release the presidential statement and full executive order text simultaneously at 6:00 a.m. chosen specifically to land after Asian markets had closed for the evening session, but before European markets opened. 6 minutes after the signing, the senior communications director came forward from her seat and placed a one-page press statement on the table. The president read it once, made 2 changes in pen, striking a phrase in the 3rd paragraph that he felt was too hedged, adding a single sentence at the end that had not been in the draft, and handed it back. The sentence he added read, "The United States does not seek conflict with China. We seek reciprocity. The difference matters enormously, and the Chinese government is capable of understanding it if they choose to." It was, in its way, a door left fractionally open. Whether Beijing would read it as such, or whether the 500% tariff wall would make it impossible to see anything through the crack, was a question that would be answered in the next 72 hours. Part 8. Washington. Before dawn. The lights in the West Wing were already on when Air Force One landed at 5:12 a.m. By 5:30, the senior staff meeting in the Roosevelt Room was underway. The Chief of Staff had been awake since the signing notification came through at 3:50 a.m. The press secretary was on her 4th coffee and her 2nd draft of talking points. The Council of Economic Advisors chair had 3 whiteboards covered in numbers and was attempting, with limited success, to project what the first 48 hours would look like across different market response scenarios. The scenarios ranged from bad to severe. In the most optimistic modeling, which everyone in the room understood to be the least likely, markets would absorb the shock over 2 to 3 sessions. Supply chains would begin a structured reorganization. Chinese leadership would reach out through back channels within a week, and the leverage created by the tariff would produce a negotiating environment that the Beijing summit had failed to generate. American manufacturers would begin the reshoring process that had been theoretically desired for decades. Allies would grumble, then adapt. The global trading system would, after a period of significant pain, arrive at a new equilibrium that was more favorable to U.S. interests. In the middle scenarios, the disruption was deeper and longer. A consumer price shock that would last 12 to 18 months, a severe market correction in the 20-35% range, Chinese retaliation that targeted American agricultural exports and rare earth supplies, a recession of moderate depth. Ugly, expensive, politically punishing, but survivable. In the worst scenario, the Treasury settlement freeze was challenged in federal court and enjoined within days. Chinese sovereign wealth funds began a coordinated drawdown of Treasury holdings. The bond market seized. The dollar came under sustained pressure. 1 or more major U.S. retailers, already operating on thin margins with China-dependent supply chains, entered bankruptcy proceedings within 60 days. Unemployment spiked. Inflation ran at levels not seen since the 1970s. The political coalition required to sustain the policy fractured before the leverage could produce results. The question of which scenario would materialize was not something any model could answer with confidence. It depended on variables that were fundamentally human. How the Chinese leadership would calculate their response, whether American institutions would hold under the legal and political pressure, whether the president's stated willingness to absorb short-term pain was genuinely credible, and whether, somewhere in the vast and damaged middle of the bilateral relationship, there remained a functional channel for the 2 powers to talk. At 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the release, the press secretary's phone buzzed. A text from a contact in Beijing, 4 words, "They're not calling back." She showed it to the chief of staff. He showed it to the president, who had just walked in from the private study, jacket on, expression unreadable. The president read the 4 words and handed the phone back. "They will," he said. At 6:00 a.m. exactly, the White House Communications Office released the executive order, the full tariff schedules, and the presidential statement to every major news organization simultaneously. On every financial terminal and every market still open, the news hit like a physical force. Part 9. The world at 6:01 a.m. The Nikkei futures, already positioned defensively through the overnight session, dropped 8.3% in the first 4 minutes after the announcement. Tokyo's early trading, which had been cautiously mixed, went into freefall. In London, which had just opened its morning session, the FTSE 100 lost 4.1% in the first 12 minutes. European futures across the continent were in deep red. The euro strengthened against the dollar on a flight to safety dynamic that was itself paradoxical. Dollar weakness in a crisis of American making. In the United States, S&P 500 futures fell to limit down within 22 minutes of the announcement, triggering circuit breakers designed to slow the cascade. The halt lasted 15 minutes. When trading resumed, the selling continued. The yuan was fixed by the People's Bank of China at a level that surprised analysts. Not the sharp devaluation many had feared as an immediate retaliatory measure, but a modest, controlled depreciation, 1.4% against the dollar. Controlled, deliberate, a signal that Beijing was not panicking, that they were managing, that they had options they were not yet deploying. The press conference in Beijing's Foreign Ministry building began at 7:15 a.m. local time, 7:15 p.m. the previous evening in Washington. The Foreign Ministry spokesperson read a prepared statement that was, by the standards of Chinese diplomatic language, a controlled demolition. The statement characterized the U.S. action as an extreme and irresponsible act of economic aggression without precedent in the history of Sino-American relations. It announced that China would immediately implement countermeasures of equivalent scope and gravity against American imports. It declared a freeze on high-level diplomatic contacts pending a full assessment of the damage caused by this unilateral and destabilizing act. And it concluded with a sentence that was being translated and retranslated and analyzed in capitals around the world within minutes of being spoken. China does not seek escalation, but China has never feared it. This was the beginning, not the end. Every professional who understood how these things worked knew that. The statement was measured, controlled, and deeply serious. It was the language of a government that had prepared for this, that had gamed the scenarios, and that was now executing a response calibrated to maximum effect. The countermeasures, when they came, and they would come, would be designed not to destroy the American economy, but to inflict precisely calibrated pain on the political constituencies whose support the administration needed most. American soybeans, pork, Boeing aircraft, semiconductor equipment, LNG exports. The targeting would be surgical. The message would be legible. Part 10. The long game begins. 3,000 miles away from the trading floors and the press conferences and the emergency calls between finance ministers in a county in rural Iowa where the grain elevators were still running and the spring planting was underway. A farmer stood in his kitchen at 6:45 a.m. reading the news on his phone. He grew soybeans. 70% of his crop in a good year went to China. He set his phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the field. This moment, this specific personal quiet moment, was replicating itself across the American agricultural heartland, across factory floors where Chinese-made components arrived in daily shipments, across retail warehouses and pharmacy supply chains and electronics assembly plants. Millions of individual economic realities, each one about to be restructured by the stroke of a pen 39,000 feet over the Atlantic. The geopolitics of tariffs and treasury freezes and diplomatic communiques existed in a register that was abstract until it wasn't, until the price of a phone became unreachable, until the prescription drug was unavailable, until a business that had been built over 20 years on a supply chain that ran through Shenzhen or Guangzhou suddenly had no viable path forward. This was the weight of what had been signed, not the financial models or the diplomatic cables or the market percentages. Those were the instruments of a decision that was, at its core, a bet about human beings. A bet that the pain of the short term was the price of a viable long term. A bet that the alternative, continuing in a system rigged against American workers and American sovereignty, was a slower, less visible, but ultimately more total form of the same damage. Whether the bet was right would not be known for years. In Beijing, in a conference room in Zhongnanhai, the senior leadership was meeting. No readout would emerge from that meeting. No statements, no leaks, no signals through the usual channels for at least 48 hours. The silence was itself a form of communication. A refusal to be rushed, a demonstration of composure, a signal that whatever response was being prepared would come on Chinese terms and on a Chinese timeline. The era of asymmetric patience had concluded. What replaced it was something new, something that did not yet have a name, something that the world was only beginning to understand it was living inside. Part 11. The first 72 hours. The next 3 days were the longest in recent American economic history. Congress exploded within hours of the announcement. The response was not cleanly partisan. Economic disruption does not respect party lines when the constituent exposure is this widespread. Republican senators from agricultural states issued statements within the first 2 hours expressing serious concern and calling for immediate consultations. The Farm State Caucus, which had been a pillar of the administration's coalition, began organizing. The retail industry's lobbying apparatus, one of the most sophisticated and well-funded in Washington, launched an emergency campaign that would produce more than 1 million constituent contacts to congressional offices within the first week. The legal challenges were filed before noon of the first day. A coalition of major importers, retail associations, and trade law firms moved simultaneously in 3 federal courts, seeking emergency injunctions against both the tariff schedule and the Treasury settlement freeze. The settlement freeze, in particular, sat on genuinely uncertain legal ground. The statutory authority being cited had never been tested at this scale, and at least 2 of the judges assigned to the initial motions had signaled, through their questions during emergency hearings, that they had significant reservations about its constitutional basis. At the State Department, the incoming communications from allied governments had reached a volume and a tone that the career staff described privately as the busiest and most uncomfortable period since 2003. The European Commission issued a formal statement calling the unilateral tariff action incompatible with WTO rules and the principles of multilateral trade governance, and announcing an emergency consultation process. Japan's government, walking the impossible line between its security alliance with Washington and its economic integration with Beijing, issued a statement of such diplomatic delicacy that it managed to say almost nothing while communicating extraordinary distress. The Federal Reserve convened an emergency session of its Open Market Committee on the second day. The statement released afterward was careful, technical, and unmistakably alarmed, noting significant uncertainty in the near-term economic outlook, and pledging to use all available tools to support economic stability, language which markets correctly read as a signal that rate cuts were coming, which itself sent a complex signal about the depth of the concern inside the central bank. On the second evening, a message came through a back channel, a Swiss banking intermediary that had been used for discreet Sino-American communication at several key junctures in recent decades. The message was brief, unattributed, and unsigned. It said that certain parties believed that a resumption of dialogue was possible under certain conditions within a framework that had not yet been discussed. It requested confirmation that the American side was willing to receive a more formal communication through the same channel. The National Security Advisor read the message twice. She walked it to the president, who was in the residence, who read it once. He asked one question: "Is it the right level?" The NSA said she believed it was. "Then tell them yes," the president said. This exchange, 40 seconds, 2 sentences, did not make the news. It would not make the news for months, possibly years. But it was, in its quiet way, the most consequential moment since the signing. The door that had been left fractionally open with a single added sentence in a presidential statement at 38,000 feet over the Atlantic had not been slammed shut by the 72 hours that followed. It remained open, barely, by a margin that could not be measured in any market index or diplomatic cable. The question was whether anyone on either side had the clarity, the courage, and the patience to walk through it. Part 12. The new architecture. History does not announce itself. It rarely arrives with the clean narrative arc that retrospective accounts impose on it. It arrives as noise, as the cacophony of simultaneous, contradictory, partially informed reactions to an event whose full implications will not be understood for years. What was certain in the days following the signing of the executive order at 38,000 feet over the Atlantic was that something structural had changed. Not because of the tariff number, though 500% was a number designed to be unignorable, and not because of the Treasury freeze, whose legal fate was still being contested in 3 courtrooms, but because of what the signing represented: a definitive, public, irrevocable statement that the United States government had concluded that the existing framework of Sino-American economic relations was not merely disadvantageous, but incompatible with American national interests, and that the cost of maintaining it was higher than the cost of breaking it. That statement could not be unsaid. It could be modified, negotiated around, softened with diplomatic language, and structured carve-outs in some future framework. But the signal it sent, to allies, to competitors, to the American manufacturing base, to Chinese leadership, to the global financial system, was permanent. The world that had existed before Air Force One lifted off from Beijing Capital International Airport would not exist again. What would exist instead was unclear. The optimists saw the pain as productive, as the necessary shock to a system so calcified by decades of asymmetric dependency that only a disruption of this magnitude could create the conditions for restructuring. They pointed to the historical precedent of the Nixon shock of 1971, when the unilateral suspension of dollar-gold convertibility had caused immediate global panic and ultimately produced a new monetary architecture that lasted for decades. They argued that American manufacturing had the latent capacity to rebuild supply chains, given sufficient time and sufficient price signal, and that the consumer pain of the short term would be compensated by the employment and economic resilience gains of the medium term. The pessimists saw a different set of historical precedents. They pointed to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which had raised tariffs on thousands of imported goods, prompted retaliatory actions from trading partners around the world, contributed to the collapse of global trade, and deepened and extended the Great Depression. They noted that the U.S. economy of the 2020s was far more deeply integrated into global supply chains than the economy of the 1930s, making the disruption costs proportionally larger. They argued that China of 2026 was not the weakened, agriculturally dependent trading partner of the 1930s historical analogs. It was a $17 trillion economy with enormous domestic demand, significant technological capability, a 1.5 billion person internal market to fall back on, and both the strategic patience and the governmental control mechanisms to absorb short-term pain in ways that a democratic government in Washington could not. Both analyses contained truth. Neither contained the whole picture. The outcome would be determined by decisions not yet made, by by leaders not yet fully tested, by populations not yet fully aware of what was being asked of them. On the fourth morning after the signing, the farmer in Iowa drove his truck to the elevator and loaded a partial shipment of last year's stored soybean crop. The elevator operator told him the export pipeline to Asia was effectively frozen. He drove home and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers and tried to understand how long he could hold on. In Shenzhen, the night shift at a factory that produced components for American consumer electronics ran its last full production cycle on standing purchase orders. The purchasing manager in Ohio had already sent notice that orders were suspended pending supply chain restructuring. 300 workers would be told in the morning that their schedules were being cut. In Washington, the lawyers were still arguing, the markets were still moving, the back channel was still open. The world was waiting to find out what it was becoming. Air Force One was back on the ground. The pen was down. The number, 500%, hung over the global economy like a verdict from a court that had not yet finished hearing the case, whose appeals were still being filed, whose final judgment would be written not by lawyers or economists or diplomats, but by the accumulation of 10 million individual decisions made by farmers and factory workers and finance ministers and traders and ordinary people in two countries who were, whether they chose to be or not, the protagonists of the New World Disorder.